So we're going to start now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the docSHARE 2023 webinar series. From February to March, we have a curated lineup of talks with local industry experts speaking on a variety of topics pertaining to documentary craft and what goes into the pre and post-production of executing your film. docSHARE is an initiative of the Documentary Filmmakers Association of South Africa to create opportunities for experienced film professionals to share their knowledge and engage with the work and contents of DFA's existing and prospective members. The program also offers a support network for 10 Tier 3 filmmakers who want to apply for their first NFVF development funding, where they access the docSHARE public sessions in addition to bespoke mentorship. This session is open to the public and we appreciate your attendance. Please note, the docSHARE program is powered by the Presidential Employment Stimulus Program, PESP3, administered by the NFVF. Thank you to the NFVF for this opportunity. Today we welcome Tiny Mungwe, who will be speaking about documentary structure, finding a roadmap. The talk will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A starting at 16:45, 4:45. So please start thinking about the questions that you want to ask her. A little bit about this topic. This session considers the questions you should, consider the question you should be asking in order to determine your filmmaking approach. Start to create a potential narrative structure, treatment, and how you effectively build a relationship with your characters. We consider what filming you should be doing at the development stage and how that footage integrates into your written proposal. Tiny, thank you so much for joining us today. Please, could you briefly introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your professional background, and please do dive into the topic right away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's so cool of you. So I am a producer. I'm a documentary producer. I work at Steps, which is a media company in Cape Town that works in producing documentaries, but also distributing them. I've worked previously as a writer and a director, but a lot of the work that I do right now is around supporting talent in realizing their films, thinking through their films. So a lot of the work that I do is editorial, which is why I thought I could speak about structure in documentary film. But as it got closer to the day of doing this presentation, I started getting really nervous because actually quite a lot of the stuff that the stuff that I think I know about story structure is very hard to crystallize and put into a presentation. But also, like, once you do, like, you come up against a lot of things and a lot of possibilities to problematize what we think we know about documentary structure. So kind of sharing this presentation is like a collection of ideas about structure, and in no way like a kind of prescription, because I think we all come into storytelling in different ways, in different directions, from different cultural points of views. And I think that there isn't like a set rule, there aren't any set rules to storytelling that are finite and concluded by now. So what I want to share is like some ideas about story structure, and then I want to leave as much time in the end for us to talk about anything that you want to discuss that relates to story structure, or to talk about your films and what you're working on, or any questions that you might have. We're going to have a little introduction. where I'm hoping that we can kind of like confront some of the assumptions about story and structure and ways to go about it. And then we're going to kind of fall into a conventional way of thinking to talk about some of the basic understood laws of storytelling, the 3X story structure, to talk about where to begin, and to talk about kind of how to implement these things through looking and listening when you're filming. So firstly, the idea about story structure, I think, gets popularized when I think commercial filmmaking and takes hold through film textbooks by a lot of writers, including most prominently Sid Field and Robert McKee. But really, the kind of heritage of story structure as we understand it, as in the 3-act story structure, is recorded in Western culture through Aristotle. And that is the idea that a story has a beginning, or a tragedy has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I think why it matters for us as filmmakers is that we're making films for an audience that has, for the most part, been consuming stories in a certain kind of way and understanding the way of telling stories according to kind of the dominant narratives that are there. So even if you want to subvert story structure, it's important to know what it is or how it works. Even if it's just to be able to communicate with your collaborators, to communicate with people who want to work with you on the story that you're working with. Why it doesn't matter, I think, is because everything else outside of the 3-act structure is interesting. I think that looking into our sort of own indigenous approaches to storytelling matters. And also, there's always room for experimentation. So I don't think it is absolutely essential that you follow a 3-act structure in how you present and how you work on your story. But for the purposes of talking about it in the beginning of this presentation, I'm going to kind of be falling back into those traditional tropes. And then I think also to think about when the question of story structure will kind of be relevant for your story. For me, I think it's when you in the development stage of your story and you're thinking about how to write your story. Kind of knowing conventions in story structure will be useful, but also knowing what the structure of your story is, what you intend to shoot, will be important. It also becomes important when you are actually filming for you to be able to recognize moments that are important for you to put in the can. And then I think story structure comes back to being important again when you're writing for the edit and when you're in the edit. I'm going to stop sharing and just check in with everyone. Is there anyone who has any questions before I go to the next slide? Any anecdotes? Okay, cool. So just go back. What I'm sharing is what can broadly be kind of thought of as the kind of laws of storytelling, and I've put that under these quotation marks so that we can make room to problematize that. Also can be thought of as expositional tools that you use when you're thinking about the different parts of your film in all the different stages of making it. So I'm referring here to a kind of traditional 3-act structure, wherein there's a beginning where you have the setup of the story, where there's a confrontation, where there's complications, where the stakes rise in your story until a midpoint, and then you have a final crisis, and then you have a denouement or resolution. And broadly, this is recognized as Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Just to check in the room, I'm actually looking in the chats. Laura says the internet is very slow. But just to check in the room, is this structure, which is very prevalent in fiction storytelling, is this familiar with everyone? Does anyone want to kind of share anything that they think about this kind of traditional 3-act structure? Okay.
Just one thing, Tiny. I'm just keen to hear your thoughts on the structure when it comes to documentary versus fiction scripted filmmaking. I think that would be quite interesting to just touch on. Thanks.
Okay, super. I will go through another 3 slides and then come back to that, and maybe we can also open it up as a conversation. But I think 3 slides from here should be coming into like moving from this theoretical framework into thinking about the filming. If that makes any sense.
Totally. Thanks. Oh, that's great. Thanks.
When you're thinking about your story, I think in the presentation, Tiny and Lauren, you talked a lot about thinking about your story when you're thinking about the elements that you need to put together for your package, having a clear idea of the beginning, middle, and end for the purposes of writing your synopsis, right? And I think right from the beginning, when you're making your synopsis, when you're writing your log line as well, it's really important to think about the conflict of your story, because that helps you to be able to figure out which are the moments that you need to be there in order to capture that for your film. So I think a very important thing that drives the narrative forward is that conflict, because it tells you what your main character is going to be doing that you're going to be filming. So I think it's important to be guided by the conflict in thinking about what is the story arc, this story arc that your character is going to be following, your main protagonist is going to be following, and taking us through the 3 acts of your story. Okay, so Kanye wants to ask, what is the difference between experimental documentaries and traditional documentaries? I'll come back to the questions. Let me get through some of the presentation, but please put the questions in the things and we'll come back to them. Yeah. And this is in response to Clifford's comment. I want to now look at your characters, because your characters kind of the elements of your story that will drive the narrative until the end of your story. So a lot of the time, we have a situation where a lot of people in the story, or because in documentary, it's usually issues driven. So you find an issue, you are filming maybe a community or an ensemble of cast, but you're not sure about who your protagonist is. And I think it's important to identify a protagonist, because your protagonist helps us to see a kind of change in your story that is only possible to follow through their point of view. It allows you to build a character arc. So your protagonist is important because it is defining your point of view. So when identifying the person within the kind of group of people that you're filming who could be your protagonist, it's important to think about what point of view they kind of offer into the story or into the world of story, but also to think about what will be kind of the obstacles that they face that allow you to show that kind of character development, that allow you to show that kind of character arc or that change in their lives. It's not antagonist. I'm sorry, that's a typo that I'm only seeing now. Antagonist is that person that character in your story that offers opposition to your protagonist. It's not necessarily the bad guy, but someone that shows, that allows the character to show their mettle, that allows the character to show what they're made of, that kind of gives your protagonist something to work against. And sometimes it's a person in your story who just offers a kind of contrast to what your main character's kind of defining characteristics are. And then supporting characters are kind of characters that also offer texture, that kind of offer different ways of looking at the kind of prevalent theme in your story. It's helpful to identify people in the film who offer that in kind of their archetypes and their roles as characters in the film. I think knowing all of these things, when you think about your story structure as you're writing your script, you want to identify moments that are going to be kind of the climax of your story, and you want to identify what will happen after the climax, what will be the kind of denouement or the third act of your film. And it's really unfortunate because a lot of the time, like for the purpose of fundraising and also for the purpose of scripting, scheduling, planning what you're going to film when and when you need to mobilize crew, you do need to think about what moments you're going to film. And so it's helpful for you to go back to those conventions of story structure, of this 3-act structure, in order to identify what could be the climax of your story, and plan so that you're there to actually film that. Plan also how you're going to film that, how you can best represent that on film, as well as to think about how you want the audience to leave the story or to leave your characters. But I think that that's often a very challenging thing. And it's very difficult to talk about it without speaking about concrete examples. So I want to invite you, Lauren, to kind of talk about how you're thinking about kind of making the transition from thinking about kind of story structure in the context of fiction storytelling, where all of the factors and all of the things are within your control, and then to think about the challenges in making this happen, especially in an observational style documentary. Okay, so earlier you asked how to, maybe repeat your question from, or maybe I misunderstood.
Well, basically, I'm just curious whether you apply the similar act structure in your thinking to a documentary film as you would to a scripted drama, for example. Like there will be different nuances, but the idea of a climax and the 3-act structure and so forth, how do you apply that in documentary? I just wanted to open that for discussion.
So for me, it's more of a question of when. I think you think about the 3-act structure in the beginning, when you're scripting, when you're writing what you're going to film. You're thinking about this so that you can be able to tell your story to potential funders, so you can tell your story to the crew that you want to bring in to actually help you make the film. Then you're actually in the process of making the film. And I think you and the people that you're collaborating with, you have to work on the basis of allowing some flexibility, making room to find other moments to film that you may not have planned, because in real life, documentary doesn't work out in the same way as fiction. But as you are filming, other things come up and become more important. And the thing that guides you to be able to identify those moments of what becomes important is you having an understanding of your story overall. What is its beginning? What is its middle? And what is its end? When you're making your film and you have this kind of hypothetical idea of what your story is, the key moments for me is the climax of the story, right? It's a story about an investigation into, it's a story about a very critical trial, right? Where something is going to be decided in the actual decision of guilty or not guilty. So that moment is critical and could very well be the climax of the story, right? And this will determine whether we see justice served or we see the characters in our film not get justice, but now they're galvanized to fight more for the thing that they want justice for. So that is kind of what happens after this critical moment of climax. So all the time that you're filming, you're following your characters in the action that they do, but you have in mind that this is the most critical moment and this is the climax. I don't know if this is helpful as a kind of example, as a hypothetical way to approach it. And I'm wondering if other people have other ways to approach it.
Hello, thank you. I think it will be important for us to just continue with the presentation so that maybe, because I think our experiences here before, this is Clifford, our experiences here before is that there will be no added time after 5. So and your exposition at the beginning was quite encouraging in terms of your experience and the issues that you want to address. So I think I will, you already gave us lots of appetite to just consume what you have, so that after that time, then maybe we can see if the questions can be consolidated. So we are eager to just hear from you. That is from me. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Clifford. So the next thing I wanted to talk about that I also think is very important as you think about story structure, but then transition to the actual practicalities of making your film, is how to begin your story. A lot of the time, you work with films where you're starting from a place of archive. Could be like news reports that kind of bring you into the story, or historical archive, or other existing material. Or sometimes you spend a lot of time in development and you also use the approach of using camera and doing camera research. So the kind of transition from when you're in production and when you're in development is unclear. But nevertheless, as you are in the process of writing your film, it's important to think about where to begin. I think that the beginning of your film needs to be a kind of hook. It's you kind of making a kind of a proposal or a proposition to your audience to say, I'm bringing you into this world, I'm introducing you to this character, and this is what they're facing, and this is the kind of journey that we will be making. So all of the kind of conventions of kind of classical, also fiction storytelling are very much relevant here. I want to share with you the opening of a film that I really like. It's a short film that you can find on AfriDocs called Home Again. It's part of Generation Africa, a collection of films produced by Steps. It's about 25 films from 16 countries across the continent. A lot of stories, all of them talking about migration from different perspectives. So this film, Home Again, was shot by Babu Kamanka, who's from the Gambia. And he has spent a lot of time making a lot of videos, communication videos for United Nations agencies, including IOM, where he makes videos about the process of returnees, people who have been deported from other countries on their way to Europe, and their efforts in reintegrating. So a lot of what he had done before was taking the official line. And he wanted in this film to tell a story which shows the story of reintegration and whether it's possible for young people coming back to the Gambia to try and build their futures, for them to build their future. So a lot of what he had to think about in the opening is, firstly, he didn't know the person who would be the character in his film. He went to the border where the deportees arrived and met all of these young people at the same time. But also he had to think about a very complex geopolitical kind of scenario that he had to introduce to the audience to explain what the film is about. So there are various techniques that he uses in the opening of the film that I kind of want to share with you. So what I was sharing is the opening of this film, which, as I said, some of the factors in the filming, the filmmaker only had that one shot of when the group, a busload of returnees arrives at the border, to film that arrival, then to meet the character, then to kind of start the film. The next time there would be a busload of arrivals would have been too late for him to be working on the film again. So what he went there with is a kind of a clear idea of what the question he's going to be asking and what he wants to be kind of following in the character's life. So you can see in the interviews there, the kind of conversation that they're having is around what was his reasons for leaving and what are his hopes for coming back. And really that opening interview sets up the main question of the film, which is this guy going to make it now that he's back home? Is he going to be able to find a way to make a life for himself as a young person in the Gambia? So I want to carry on sharing towards the end of my little PowerPoint thing. And then I wanted to just kind of like point out that with an awareness about story structure, with an awareness about who your main character is, what you want to follow in the action that they're taking, what is the unfolding narrative that you have. A very big part of your job when you actually start filming is looking and listening and identifying during the filming so that you can use small moments and details to tell the larger story of your film. I actually put this down here because a filmmaker I was talking to just like a couple of weeks ago, like said this to me, like just like very offhanded, but I think it's like so like true that we forget that film is about lights, camera, and action. So in documentary, it's about being there for that moment in order to put it into the can and be able to use it in putting together your kind of larger story. What I wanted to share about looking and listening and finding small moments and details that kind of tell you the larger details of the story is in a link. So I want to maybe, I want to share the link with you, Elilwani, and I'm not going to waste time by trying to share it on my side. But if you can go to the time code. Try and put on English captions for us, please, Taryn.
Tiny, they seem to be.
No, it's playing with subtitles. The subtitles are inside. You can just play it.
The door. Surround which supports. Clean. Quand tu écris avec la flèche sur la droite, tu fais quoi? Si c'est pas bon, tu fais quoi? Effacer. 20. Oh. Non, on va compter maintenant. On écrit ou bien, faut pas parler. On écrit ou bien on fait oralement. C'est fini. C'est pas fini. Je vais pas compter non. On écrit. C'est fini. C'est pas fini. Tu vas pas compter. Hein? Pourquoi? Je ne veux pas compter. Je vais apprendre seulement à écrire et à lire, mais pas à compter. Aïe, ça c'est pas normal. Si tu veux partir en Algérie, là, faut chercher à connaître un peu.
Thank you for sharing that, Taryn. I wanted to share that scene because it's one of my favorite scenes in the film, The Last Shelter, by Usman Samaseko. And it shows life in this kind of halfway house for migrants on a kind of frontline town in Mali, where migrants were coming back from their experiences and trauma on the desert, and migrants who are preparing to go kind of live in this kind of liminal kind of space. And it shows the relationship between these two girls, but also the relationship between them and the other people in the shelter, how close they are, how confined they are with each other, but also the kind of tension of waiting to leave. So earlier I was talking about kind of being aware about what the climax of the story is. In this story, the climax is when these two girls actually leave, and they leave the shelter and they go and take their chances in the desert. And a lot of the tension in the story is around how unsafe it is for them to go on this trip. It's about also how they're driven by their dreams to want to go. It's about that push and pull of the kind of like call of the desert and the call of adventure and the call to kind of fulfill your dreams. So I think like an awareness about what you want to do with story structure is really important for you to be able to recognize these very small moments which help you to kind of reinforce your intentions with your story. So I'm almost done with the presentation. Here I wanted to kind of like talk a little bit about chronology and narrative. That is kind of like understanding the kind of chronology of events as they happen, as you and your character are there and the filming and the capturing is happening, and contrasting that with the narrative, and that is the how you're going to tell the story. Understanding that there's this difference when it comes to documentary, and that when you're thinking about your story structure, you're actually thinking about the narrative, and that you can and should make a distinction between these two. This can be very helpful also in thinking about and working out your story structure. In the clip that I showed you earlier with The Last Shelter, a lot of what comes up is also like the tension, the story tension that is a kind of inherent as you work your way towards the climax of the story. So you thinking through how you can use story tension to build towards the climax. Is you thinking about how to shoot for this, and also how you're going to edit for this effect. And then I think also equally important is for you to think about when to end, as well as how to end the story. Because where your story ends, a lot of what we see is the kind of contrast between how or what your character was like when we first met them, and how they've gone through an arc, and how they've kind of seen a change that can be seen towards, well, in how they are at the end of the story. So yeah, that's the end of kind of like my kind of ideas around story structure. I'm sorry that it's taken a while. I'm happy to carry on a little bit after 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Maybe we could go to the questions in the chat first.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tiny. I think if we have anyone has any questions at this moment, we can do that. But I feel like we should just go to the questions on the chat group, because we don't have much time. We have to conclude at 5 p.m.
So the question from Kanye about what is the difference between experimental documentaries and traditional documentaries. I find that a very tricky question. I think that most directors are trying to experiment with every film that they're making, but there are conventions of form that I think are relevant, especially when it comes to like programming, as well as like programming for festivals, as well as programming for broadcast. So the question about experimental, I think, is about kind of unconventional use of sound, unconventional use of camera, unconventional use of archive, and editing in order to put the documentary together. And so that is kind of a film that will be doing something that's unconventional compared to most of the creative documentaries that we see, or most of the narrative documentaries that are linear in form, narrative documentaries that have very conventional kind of approaches to storytelling, quite a lot of what I've talked about in this talk here. And then Cheryl.
Question from Linda. I think it's from Ois.
Yeah.
No, I think she was agreeing. I think Cheryl was just agreeing with you. But it's a question from Linda about, I think you can read it out loud so that we don't have to repeat it.
Does a government system, etc., make a good antagonist for a docu, or must a filmmaker find a representative of a system who will serve as a representation of the antagonistic system? So what you're really talking about here, Linda, is not being able to film a lot with, or film the antagonist a lot, and how to work around that. Is this what you mean by your question? Yeah, but I'm assuming that that's what Linda means. And I think that you can show your protagonist up against a system as a way to show that system as the antagonist, or the kind of cause for conflict in what your antagonist is doing, or the journey that you're following them on. So it could be talking about it, it could be kind of dealing with the bureaucracy, it could be protesting, it could be listening to news reports. Yeah, I think that there are ways to show like systemic injustice as the antagonist in the story that you're telling, without having to interview or follow or give as much screen time to that antagonist in the traditional sense. And I hope that that's helpful. All of this was just complaints about the technical in the film. Yes, Linda says yes, when the antagonist is not necessarily a person. I would be interested what you think about it also, but Matlalupile, Matlalepule, how do you structure a documentary about a place or an object? Usually we document a character and go on a straightforward structure. does telling a story without a character have a different structure? Firstly, I think that your film should take the structure that you feel it needs to take. I think that some of like the conventional approaches to storytelling, classical storytelling, can be used in telling story about a place. And I think that there are many like different kind of ways to do that. I think it's very hard to kind of like give, like, I feel like I'm like this advice machine just popping out advice, and that's very dangerous. But but I do think that lots of films telling stories about a place have been successful without having to use conventions like interviews. So I'm thinking about like ways to describe a place, like maps can be used to describe a place, locations, time of day, how a place looks at different time of day, how a place is used by people on a seasonal basis, so different time of day, but also different seasons, looking at architecture. So there are all of these different ways to look at how to tell the story about or tell a thing about a place and not a person. And I think like a really like banal convention in storytelling that I think is always like is like the 4 W's and the how. I don't know if people in the room know this. It's the what, where, why, who, in whichever order makes sense, and then the how. This could be a way for you to also hang a structure around an unconventional kind of character, as it were. I don't know if that's helpful. There are other people with a lot of experience in the room, like Pablo and Carolyn. And this is just people who are using their real names, and Liesel and Tara. So I would really welcome other people to answer these questions. But yeah, that's my view, is that it is possible to tell a story about a place and also be able to think about a structure for that story.
Thank you so much, Tiny. I think we have to wrap it up now just because of time. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. We really, really, really appreciate all the excellent advice you've shared with us. And I'm sure everybody appreciates that, you know. I just want to let everybody know that they can tune in for our next docSHARE webinar on Thursday, 16 March. With Enver Samuel speaking about applying to the NFEF and other funding 101. Thank you so much, Tiny. That's it from us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm writing my email address on the chat. Anyone wants to reach out to me. And cool. Thank you so much.